Do you know what goes into a pet food label? Now, it can be super confusing when you take a look at the bag or the can and wondering what does that chicken dinner meal mean? Or even, is there certain types of testing? That's what we're going to be talking about in this short video. I'm Dr. Katie Woodley, holistic veterinarian and founder of The Natural Pet Doctor. And in this brief video, I'm going to talk about some of the important factors that you need to know about as you read pet food labels to truly understand what it means, some of the food trials that go into making the pet food, and also to what certain types of rules mean and what that can mean for when you see certain ingredients further down on the list or at the top of the list. So if you're excited about this, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and that way you can get notified when new content drops. And if you need more guidance and support, make sure you get our simple guide to improving your pet's food. I hope you enjoy. These studies coming out that showcase that we can use food as medicine, we can change the disease processes, all because of what we feed our pets and ourselves. So we're going to start with that pet food label. So if you have your food close to your pet's food, grab it, because you're going to want to take a look at these and see as we go along. Maybe you're going to see some of these ingredients or know what we're actually looking at. And then we can also answer your questions at the end too, based on some of the foods and brands you may be feeding. So there are a couple main parts that make up that pet food label. First, you're going to see the ingredient list. So it says ingredients, pretty obvious. It's going to list everything. You're going to notice that typically your vitamins and your minerals, the supplements are going to be listed at the back end of that. So a lot of those things that we can't pronunciate really well, those are going to be your synthetic vitamins and minerals. And then we have the next part typically that follows that is your guaranteed analysis. So this is going to tell us roughly how much protein, fat, fiber, moisture is present in these foods. And then at the bottom, typically you might have to look for this, is that AFCO statement. So let's talk about what that means a little bit more in depth. So pet food labeling is regulated at two different levels. The federal regulations, those are enforced by the US FDA, so the Food and Drug Administration. So what they do is they establish standards applicable for all animal feeds. They look at proper identification of the product, the net quantity statement, the manufacturer's name and address, and proper listing of ingredients. And then some states also enforce their own labeling regulations. But many states have adopted the model pet food regulations established by the Association of American Feed Control Officials, or AFCO. So you probably heard me say AFCO quite a bit. So that's what that means. It's actually a nonprofit organization that comes up with regulations that they recommend. It's not required though. These regulations though are more specific in nature. So they cover the different aspects of labeling such as product name, guaranteed analysis, the nutritional adequacy statement, feeding directions, and then also calorie statements. And the guaranteed analysis, this is going to indicate the minimum or maximum levels of nutrients. So like protein, fats, fiber, moisture. You are not going to find the amount of carbohydrates present in the food here though. We actually have to calculate that out for each food. So we talk about low carb foods, high carb foods. You're not going to find that on the label. So that can make it a little bit difficult to assess, is this an appropriate carb content for, say, a cat? Also, the fact that this is either minimum or maximum levels makes it difficult to determine if this is the optimal level for your pet. These are not guarantees of the quality of the food. And then, of course, moisture levels are going to vary between each product, so which also makes it really difficult to assess the carbohydrate content, the protein content present in the product you're looking at. So a lot of times we'll look at canned food and we'll look at the protein levels and we'll compare it to a dry food protein levels. And you're like, I thought canned food was higher in protein, but it looks lower. But then when we do the calculation and we convert everything to dry matter, that canned food is typically going to be higher in protein content. So it can be really confusing when you're just looking at those bare numbers on the back of the bag. The nutritional adequacy statement. So this is AFCO's statement on how the food is tested to determine if it's adequate for your pet. So the package states Like typically the food supports all life stages. So if you see that, it can be a little bit confusing and a little bit make you feel a little bit weary of it, because the problem with that is the product likely contains excessive nutrient levels that are necessary for most demanding life stage. So that's your kittens, that's growth. So kittens and puppies, they need those extra nutrients. So they're going to contain higher levels of protein, higher levels of calcium, but those levels may be inappropriate for, say, like a senior cat. So this is one of the many reasons why I advocate looking at your pet as an individual, because those requirements change based on their life stage, based on their lifestyle, how active they are. And if there are any disease conditions, then we should be feeding the foods that are going to be appropriate for them. And then AFCO testing. So this is really interesting. So AFCO actually allows two basic methods for pet food manufacturers to substantiate their claims. You'd think food trials are required, right? How else are we going to know a pet thrives when they're eating foods if we're not actually doing a trial and we're feeding it to them? However, most foods choose to formulate the food based on the AFCO nutrient profiles. This method, this is less time consuming, and it's also cheaper for those companies because it only requires a calculation of the nutrient levels. So they can take that food and say, yep, ticks off the box for calcium requirements. Yep, ticks off the box for taurine. And the feeding trial method is technically gold standard. But here's the kicker. When we actually look at what goes into a feeding trial, you're going to be surprised. The protocol only requires 6 animals to pass based on a physical examination, not losing weight, but they can become overweight on that food because that's okay, right? No. And then 4 blood values over the length of only 6 months. It's insane when we look at that. So pet companies have stated that they can make a piece of leather fit those AFCO standards. And I'm pretty sure leather is not a healthy meal for a pet, or I wouldn't want to feed that to my dog or my cat. I don't think they'd actually eat it, but it can fit the AFCO requirements. So for those foods that make complete and balanced claims, remember, we want balanced food. I talk about that a lot. So AFCO statements are going to be the bare minimum. Doesn't guarantee that that food is optimal, and most pet foods are going to have that AFCO statement on there. If you don't see this, run, put it back, burn it, do whatever, run from that brand if there's not an AFCO statement on there. But they make these balanced claims by 3 different definitions that you can see here that can appear on the package. So these are going to include product X is formulated to meet the nutritional levels established by the AFCO dog or cat nutrient profiles for life stage Y. So that's going to be just the test, not a food trial. And then the second one would be animal feeding tests using AFCO procedures to substantiate that product X provides complete and balanced nutrition for life stage Y. So that's going to be those feeding trials with 6 pets passing it over 6 months. And then the final thing you may see, which is kind of the most confusing and blurry, is the product X provides complete and balanced nutrition for life stage Y and is comparable in nutritional adequacy to a product which has been substantiated using AFCO feeding trials. They're testing nutrient profiles. That's what that statement means, but it's confusing because they're throwing in the wording, the feeding trial. So those are things that you're going to look for on the back of the bag to see how was this food actually tested. And these are a couple examples from labels that I just pulled off the internet. And so that first one, you'll see the AFCO cat food nutritional facts. You'll see grain-free real turkey recipe cat food is formulated to meet the nutritional levels established by the AFCO cat food nutrient profiles for all life stages. So this can be fed to kittens, it can be technically fed to senior cats, it fits all life stages, it hits the minimum, the maximum, it's not outside those ranges, and that food has not gone through a food trial. Whereas the other one at the very bottom, you'll see there, the AFCO statement, animal feeding tests using AFCO procedures substantiate that Science Diet Adult Advanced Fitness Original Dog Food provides complete and balanced nutrition for maintenance of adult dogs. So this doesn't say all life stages. So this is only for adult dogs, so not senior dogs. And then they've also done those animal feeding tests. So this gives you an example of the different things that you might read for those AFCO statements on the back of the food that you have. And that should be present on every single food. So dry, wet, any types of pet food that you're feeding, these should be present. So product name, this is a key factor of what we think about when we want to buy a product. So for that reason, manufacturers are going to use fancy names and other techniques to emphasize particular aspects of the product. This is where things get real sneaky. And so the percentages of named ingredients in that total product are going to be dictated by a few AFCO rules. So 95% rule, what does that mean? So this applies to products consisting primarily of very few ingredients. So they're going to have, you're going to see simple names like beef for dogs or tuna cat food. So in these examples, at least 95% of that product must be that named ingredient, so beef or tuna. So that's not counting the water added for processing. When we count the added water, that named ingredient still has to comprise 70% of the product. Because ingredient lists, they have to be listed in the proper order of the predominant ingredient by weight. Beef or tuna, for those examples, should be the first ingredient listed, followed often by water, and then we're going to see other compounds such as like vitamins and minerals. The 25% or dinner rule applies to many canned and dry products also. So if the named ingredients comprise at least 25% of the product, not counting water, but less than 95%, the name has to include a qualifying descriptive term. So this is where we see foods use dinner, as in beef dinner for dogs. And then counting that added water, those named ingredients still must comprise 10% of the product. So we just went from 25 to potentially 10. So anywhere in there. You're going to see potentially other descriptors too. So we talked about dinner. However, if you see platter, entree, nuggets, formula, those are a few other examples that these pet food companies will use to reduce the amount of higher cost proteins present in that food. So in the example, beef dinner for dogs, only a quarter of the product has to be beef. And beef would most likely be like the third or fourth ingredient on that ingredient list. So have a look at the foods that you're feeding right now and see if your company is potentially doing that. Because the primary ingredient is not always the named ingredient and may in fact actually be an ingredient that you don't want to feed to your pet, this is why we have to look at the ingredient list before we purchasing. So like a cat, let's talk about pet parents. Say you want to avoid buying a product that has fish in it. You're like, my cat doesn't like fish. I don't want fish. So I'm like, oh, this is fantastic. This food says chicken formula cat food. However, this is not probably the best choice since some chicken formulas, that's that added word, may actually contain fish. And sometimes they actually contain even more fish than chicken. So another great reason why we need to be looking at that ingredient list and knowing what some of these words mean. And then the final one, so the 3% rule or the with rule. So now AFCO model regulations allow the use of the term with as part of the product name. So dog food with beef, cat food with chicken. So now even a minor change in the wording of the name has a dramatic impact on the minimum amount of that named ingredient required. So for example, like a can of cat food with tuna could be confused with a can of tuna cat food, right? Super confusing. But the latter example has to contain at least 95% tuna. So if it says tuna cat food, that has to be 95% tuna, whereas cat food with tuna only needs 3% tuna. So we have to be reading these labels really carefully before we purchase to make sure that we're actually choosing the desired product. So this is an example of the 3% rule. So notice the label at the top says with beef, right? Chopped ground dinner with beef. Sounds delicious, right? However, look at the ingredient list that I added to that picture. Where's beef? Takes a little while, right? I'm like, wait, shouldn't this say chopped ground dinner with chicken? However, so 4 to 5 ingredients down the list, we see beef. So if you wanted to avoid chicken, chicken's the first ingredient. But there's all sorts of other things going on with this food. So we also have meat byproducts, which, by the way, When it's not specified, so you see meat, byproducts, third ingredient on that ingredient list. That means any type of animal that can come from sick animals, animals that were already dead, that they brought to the slaughterhouse, diseased, horses, cows, dogs, cats, whatever that was not able to be used in human grade meat, it can be included. And this actually makes up the first ingredient. And we're going to talk a little bit about meat meal versus meat, but chicken is 75% water. It's not dehydrated yet. And when we have meat byproducts, those are going to probably be higher than chicken. So super scary. And then also when we look further down, so I'm looking at these ingredients, not super impressed by this food. Carrageenan is on there. And why they use that, we find these in a lot of wet foods because it gives that texture to the wet food. And it's actually a known GI irritant. If you have a dog, especially cats, and they're on a canned food and they're just so sensitive, you need to be making sure that carrageenan is not in that food, because a lot of times when you take them off that food, the inflammation goes away, they stop vomiting, they stop having diarrhea, and your problem is solved. So just don't even feed this product. Horrible, but I wanted to show you, it's a great example how a company will use with in the label, but they can get away with chicken being a bigger proportion of that food than the actual beef. And so that's that 3% rule. Ingredient list. Okay, hopefully you have your bags of food. So checking out those ingredient lists, you're following along. This is about empowering you so you know how to optimize your pet's health through food. I want you to look at this ingredient list. I want you to ask yourself, would I feed this to my puppy? Do you think these ingredients lead to optimal health? This is actually one of the big brands, and it's made specifically for golden retriever puppies. So let's break down the ingredient list a little bit and what you need to be looking for. So remember, all these ingredients, they're required to be listed in order of predominance by weight. So the weights of ingredients, they're determined as they're added in the formulation. So that's including their inherent water content. So this latter fact's really important when we're evaluating the relative quantity claims, especially when ingredients of different moisture contents are being compared. So this is especially true when we're comparing canned versus your bagged food, so your dry kibbles. They're going to be very different. So for example, one pet food may list meat as its first ingredient and corn as the second ingredient. So like even if it says chicken. So the manufacturer is not going to hesitate to point out that its competitor lists corn first and meat meal as second, suggesting that that competitor's product has less animal source protein than its own. However, that meat is really high in moisture, so about 75% water. And on the other hand, the water and fat are already removed from meat meal, so it's only 10% moisture. So what's left is mostly protein and minerals. So if we could compare both products on a dry matter basis, so this means we remove water from both ingredients, we can actually see that the second product actually had more animal source protein from meat meal than the first product had from meat, even though the ingredient list would suggest otherwise. So this is not to say that the second product has more meat than the first, or in fact, any meat at all. Meat meal is an interesting rabbit hole to go down to, because most of the fat and water have been removed by rendering. So rendering is a whole nother topic that is a way to use cheaper proteins in pet foods. So, but keep in mind, your ingredients must be listed by common or usual names too. Ingredient splitting. So this is where the cheaper products broken into smaller portions to appear that they make up less of the diet. So this is a tricky way of subdividing a more abundant but cheaper ingredient into smaller portions. So looking at these two labels, there's a couple examples of ingredient splitting. For example, you may see corn broken down into corn gluten meal, corn flour, whole ground corn. There's also whole wheat flour, ground yellow corn. There's rice flour, soy flour. There's corn gluten meal, and that top one, whole grain corn, flaxseed, soybean meal. There's wheat gluten. So what it's doing by doing this ingredient splitting, the weight of the corn is now divided into 3, which allows meat to actually look like it's the number 1 or second ingredient in the food, even though it's not. So look for that in that ingredient list. And another tactic that pet food companies use is with salt. So AFCO recommends that dry dog food contains at least 0.3% sodium and that dry cat food contains at least 0.2% sodium for both maintenance and to support normal growth and development. So those are the minimum recommended levels. However, there's this thing called the salt rule. And because most pet foods use similar formulas, the rule of thumb is typically that any ingredient that follows salt on the list must make up less than 1% of the diet. So this has to be true for ingredients like vitamins and trace minerals because only small amounts are needed. So we can use salt on an ingredient list as a convenient marker of quantity. So what pet food companies will do is put beautiful pictures of real food on their bags, like blueberries, broccoli, carrots, like all sorts of things, right? And we like that. We feel like we're feeding that. However, if you think your pet food has a lot of like healthy ingredients like blueberries and real food, go to the ingredient list and see where salt is. If it's listed after salt, there's probably a sprinkle or 1 blueberry in that entire bag. So they're tricking us. So when we see that, I kind of go, that company just made me kind of angry. Like that's irritating. But we can also look at the first part of the ingredient list. I don't always discount companies that do this, but if everything else that they're doing is right. But this is something we need to be aware of. Thanks for watching that short clip that was taken from our Better Gut Health program and is included also in our 21-day Better Gut Health Challenge. Knowing what to feed your pets is really, really important. So once again, I invite you to grab our free guide on how to improve your pet's food, where you'll get more feedback, recommendations, even recipes, and how to transition your dogs and cats to a higher quality food so we can help improve their overall health. I look forward to seeing you all in our next video. Take care.